This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this week's programming with our cattle market update. This week, we are joined by Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. She shares insight on the last week's market changes and talks through recently released export data for January. Also ahead, Associate Professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, David Hyten, recently visited K-State to serve as the 36th Annual Elmer G. Heyne Crop Science Lecturer. He joins us to discuss his long-term research in soybean genetics and how he hopes to genetically improve soybeans to be more successful in Nebraska. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts concludes today's show with this week's wildlife segment. Today, he discusses urban coyotes and the difficulties we face when managing them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are beginning today's programming with our cattle market update for the week, and joining us for that this week is Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. So, Katelyn, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. So today we wanted to start with prices that we've seen in the fed and feeder cattle markets. Anything crazy there in the last week or so?
Well, on the cash prices, the Dodge City auction saw a pretty significant drop from the previous week in 5 to 6 weights. The first week of March was 207, which was the highest it had been in a couple weeks. And then this week it dropped all the way back down to 188. Now, the rest of the weight groups for steers only knocked about $2 to $3 off that price. I think this time of year we're sorting out if we're going to have grass or not and wondering what the forage conditions are going to be like. And so I would expect it to be slightly bumpy until maybe that picture is a little clearer. Now on the fed cattle side, cash prices continue to hold 165, which is a fantastic price. I think the big question to me on fed cattle is going to be where demand is moving forward. It definitely seems like that U.S. consumer is starting to have a little bit weaker position if you look at credit card debt balances growing, but we haven't really seen that impact to demand or even beef price for that matter as of yet. Now, in terms of the futures market, feeder cattle supplies ended the week on a sour note. They fell back quite a bit, almost across the board. They lost about $1.50 to almost $2, for most of this year and into next year. Those fall contracts are pretty high, still over $220 in both October and in November, but closer to $191, $197 here in the nearby. And again, I think the nearby is going to be sorting out kind of what the feed outlook is until we get a little clearer picture. And then those fall contracts seem to be building in quite a bit of optimism about what the corn production looks like this year. But all of that remains to be seen. On the live cattle futures, the week ended a little bit down. Most of the contracts were down less than $1. The summer contracts are a little bit weaker than where we are today on the cash price and a little weaker than that fall price. That's a pretty normal seasonal pattern. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if those June and August contracts bounce around a little bit, depending on what placements do here in the next couple weeks. A lot of at least heavyweight cattle, those could be potentially fed into that quarter. Now, on the meat side of things, boxed beef closed the week at $284.91, and compared to last Friday, that's about $1 or so higher. So holding a relatively strong value in terms of wholesale choice beef. And that's the thing we're going to be watching for any kind of indication that maybe retailers aren't moving product quite as well. Retail prices seem like they've been pretty sticky. There are some featuring, but they actually haven't moved the sticker price down very much on a lot of these products. So something we're continuing to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah, at least those things aren't moving up still. I feel like that's a bit of optimism there in this case scenario. Then also you mentioned, obviously, we're in this period of anticipation almost of spring. I think across the board in all manners of the industry, we're just kind of waiting to see when spring actually arrives for us and then what the outcomes of that will be. So maybe a bit pessimistic to start with those futures that we started with at the beginning of the year, and now we're starting to kind of slowly become a bit more optimistic, like you mentioned.
I think the weather thing has been complicated by this anticipation that we're going to roll from a La Nina to an El Nino type of weather pattern at some point in 2023. And when that happens, that can have a lot of different impacts. So Just as a reminder, La Nina typically has a very dry southern tier of the U.S. and a fairly, colder, more wet northern tier. And so if you think about, we're still in La Nina right now, that would mean probably the northern tier states. So we're thinking Montana, the Dakotas, etc. Spring might be a little late for them, and their calf prices are doing pretty good. I was up in Montana about a week ago, and they were better than, they were closer to 250, 240 for those 5 to 6 weights. And in North and South Dakota, I think we're closer to 220 or 230. Those cattle probably moving out of those states just because it's still very much winter up there, and it might be winter for quite a bit longer. Like, you would need to feed those animals for quite a while until you could have grass in that part of the country. Now, where you are, you're probably starting to see a little tinge of green, but maybe not much, depending on how much moisture you've gotten. And the other factor of this is we're on 3 years worth of pastures that have just been probably really had some hard years in terms of not a lot of recovery, continuing to just drought. That's very hard to recover inside of 1 year. And so I think the grass problem here is still unknown, how much it recovers, what kind of stocking rates you can use when it does, and then the timing of spring. So I think for a lot of the feeder cattle markets, outside the Southern Plains, these feeder cattle rallies have been maybe a little earlier than normal anyway. And some of that's just, I think, optimism about what the potential is. Now, if everyone has grass and everything's great, I think these prices are absolutely justified. But I think we don't know yet.
Another thing you wanted to talk about today was recent export data that was released this past week. So exports play a key role in how our industry operates here in the U.S. So what did that data really show?
This is January 2023 data, so the first look at what this year is going to look like. And just think back, 2021 and 2022 were both record volume years for exports. And January really started off on a negative note, just down 16% below last year. Just for the month. And we saw a pullback almost universally across the board. Canada was even with a year ago, but China was down 25%, Taiwan down more than 30%, Japan and Mexico, few bright spots, up 7% for Japan and 31% for Mexico, but South Korea and Vietnam also both significantly down by double digits. Now, we did import more product. That was up 4% in total. And probably the big story out of this is going to be Brazil shipped I believe it was a record high for the month. And some of that is due to what the TRQ quotas are. Brazil is shipping into other countries' bucket. And this happened last year where they shipped a lot of product early in the year and then tailed off, trying to get that preferential treatment before the quota bucket fills up. They were up about 5% from last year. Argentina sent 15% more, Canada sent 14% more. And so overall, a pretty strong import month. Now, one of the things that's happening with, imports and exports is going to be, what the relative currency value is and how expensive beef is relatively here and what we can buy it for and all of those relative values. And so it remains to be seen maybe what the rest of the year looks like. We have a fairly aggressive import projection out there. We're up about 7 to 10% over a year ago in 2023. So that big number up front helps our forecast, I guess, come true if you want. And then we have a fairly substantial decline in beef exports, but we were only thinking about 2 to 5%. So we aren't expecting this big 16% drop to continue, but maybe recession in the rest of the world and U.S. beef is pretty expensive, but we'll have to wait and see on that a little bit.
Like you mentioned, this was January data because we do lag a few months behind in terms of getting these reports back and this becoming public knowledge. So as we head into March and we're thinking about anticipating February data coming out, do you think that these strong trends will continue or we're continuing to import kind of more of these cheaper beef supplies? Or do you think we're going to scale back on that as our economy hopefully continues to look a bit more stable?
I think we'll probably import product either way, just because we are looking at a declining production structure from a U.S. standpoint. So we're expecting less U.S. beef production overall, and imports will help fill that gap here in the U.S. Now, is it going to be 4% above a year ago every month? Maybe, maybe not. I think grilling season is coming up and people will want to have more product on hand for Memorial Day. So you might see it ramp up a little bit stronger actually coming into this. And then for beef exports, that market's really been driven by China in the last 2 years. And so to see them slip down to under 60 million pounds in the last 6 or 7 months, that's a pretty big change from what the last 2 years have been. And so I don't know if seasonality is what you'd call that, but it's really going to depend on how they interact with our market, as they have been such a driving factor for the last 2 years.
Also had some recent data released in our monthly WASD report. And I don't always cover our WASD on our cattle markets because sometimes it's not anything crazy. And this month wasn't anything crazy in terms of data they released too, but I figured it'd just be informative to kind of bring that data to the conversation today.
So probably the biggest story for cattle country out of the WASD is going to be the corn market. It did outline a more bullish stance on corn. The big story there is going to be that South America has had some production struggles this year, and in Argentina is listed now at down about 7% from a year ago. And so the pretty big changes there on the corn side, and anticipating corn is going to be more expensive than maybe we thought 6 months ago. On the beef production side, not a lot of change. Their 2023 projection was revised up about just under 200 million pounds. No changes to imports or exports. And so those forecasts are holding pretty steady. On the price side, they did raise their live steer price up from 159 last month to 162. So a pretty big jump there as an annual average price. Now, their quarters, they do have a little bit lighter third quarter, which I touched on earlier in the program, about 159. So pretty close to where those future prices are right now today.
Well, Katelyn, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation and all of the insight you provided, whether that was through the WASD data we just walked through or our export data that was released last week. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock, joining us for this week's Cattle Market Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by a friend from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He is associate professor there, where he holds the Haskins Professorship. His name is Dr. David Hyten, and he's here at K-State joining us today because he recently served as a guest lecturer for the 36th Annual Elmer G. Heyne Crop Science Lectureship. So before we get into our topic today, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. And you specifically study soybeans genetics, which is a really cool topic. But before we get into kind of the research you're actively doing, how did this research come about and when did you first get started with it?
I started actually in soybean genetics research back in '97 as a student worker at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. And so at that time, it was mapping SCN resistance to soybean. From there, I've kind of always had this career path of working in soybeans, whether it was in a soybean breeding program or soybean genetics in my PhD, or working for USDA ARS as a research scientist doing soybean genetics, and then working at DuPont Pioneer at the time, which is now Corteva, as a scientist there doing genetics. And so, yeah, I've been working in soybean research for quite a while now.
Yeah, very cool career then. You've been in the top areas of this research for a long time, it sounds like. And now you've kind of taken that to your work at Nebraska-Lincoln. So whenever this soybean study came about, you've been working on yield stability on the genetic side. Where did you first get this question and how did it get started?
You know, we always say in soybean breeding, there's three traits that you got to worry about: yield, yield, and yield. And so how we can better understand yield and what makes up yield and the genetics that can make it up, the better we can work in breeding and developing better lines. And so one of the things that we know with soybean yield is that it can vary across the environment. You know, you could have some areas where a soybean line may not yield as well, while other areas it yields very good. And then some lines can just yield really good no matter where they're planted. So what we really wanted to look at was what's the genetic differences between the lines that yield well across lots of locations and which ones that may be up and down in locations, because it's really important for farmers year in and year out. They want consistent yields, and they don't want a line that yields well this year and the next year it just bombs out. So we wanted to see what was that consistent genetics that we can then incorporate into our new lines as we develop them.
Absolutely. So in terms of Nebraska's environments, how many different environments would you say your research revolves around across the state of Nebraska?
You know, Nebraska is a very long state and very variable state, like I'm sure Kansas is too. And so soybeans is really grown on the eastern part of the state, from the middle east. And I would say, there's probably like 3 or 4 mega environments in Nebraska that can be defined with soils and so forth in that part of the state. But across the state, there's just a large gradient of environments, from rainfall being very wet in the eastern part to very dry in the western part, to elevation changes from east to west too.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of diversity there, as we have here in Kansas, I'm sure you know. And we also have been experiencing an ongoing drought in the last year or so. And I know Nebraska experienced one not too long ago as well. So did that come into account in any of your research you've been doing?
So for what we've been looking at, we've been doing drought resistance as kind of a separate topic of ours. So the research that we're looking at for yield stability, we've been looking at it mostly under irrigated fields. There's a large proportion in Nebraska that is irrigated. And so we're trying to look at what other factors other than just rainfall can be affecting this yield stability.
Absolutely. So on the genetic side of things, what does this process look for you as a researcher? What does that look like in your lab?
So there's 2 things that we have to do. Is one, we have to take a population of soybean lines that are genetically different from each other, and we grow them across lots of environments. And so we've taken 2 different soybean populations, and one we grew in about 13 different environments over 3 years. And by environments, that's different field locations or different years. And then the other population, we grew another 3 years in about 11 environments. We want to see how do they yield across these 20 or so different environments. And then what we do is we end up sequencing the lines. And so we find out, DNA sequence is made up of 4 bases, A, T, C, G, as they're abbreviated. So we actually go in there and we decode that genome for each of those lines, and we see what are the genetic differences between them. And then those genetic differences we compare to the phenotype, and through our analysis, we can figure out, okay, here are the regions that are contributing to a line yielding better over the environments.
I know this research has been going on for several years now. So overall, your findings, what kind of has been a consistent theme throughout all of it?
So what we know is there's a portion of yield that is made up of just genetics, where no matter what environment you plant it in, the genetics adds to yield. Then there's this, what we call a genetics by environment interaction. So the genetics, if it's in one environment, that gene can then give positive yield, or is giving positive yield. And in different environments, it's giving negative yield. Depending on where it's planted, it's either going to be a benefit or it's going to be a hindrance. And right now in selection, these are kind of ignored because whenever you average them across environments, they average essentially zero benefit. The negatives and the positives cancel each other out. But what happens is if they're randomly segregating in a population, if you get too many negatives for field A and it's all positive for field B, it's going to perform well in field B, but it's not going to perform in field A. And so what breeders have to do is they have to have a balance of these genes so that the lines that they're trying to release will have, equal number of positives for field A and an equal number of positives for field B.
When you talk to producers about your research, about the impacts and implications of it on their end, what do those conversations typically look like for you?
It's really about trying to figure out what's the best way for us to create lines that not only have the highest yield, but then the highest consistent yield. And so it's really adding in that consistency part. And by trying to breed for that earlier in the breeding pipeline, we hope that not only will that add to the stability, but then it also help us make larger gains on that just overall yield too. And so it's really getting that fuller picture of yield.
Sure. So the real life implications of this, you're already seeing it carry out, I'm sure, in some of the producers' fields that you've interacted with. What has that impact been like to watch?
Well, that's the thing about breeding. So anytime you start breeding, it's 8 to 10 years before that line actually gets released. And so as we start implementing these techniques, it's going to be another 5-6 years, even as we're in the middle of the breeding pipeline, before you actually start to see those results. And so, the thing about breeding is that it's a long-term endeavor, no quick hits, essentially. But we know as we're integrating that into the program, we look forward to being able to see that actually impact fields.
Sure, yeah. So long-term research here, and we were talking beforehand that you look forward to this potentially being expanded to, other regions of the United States too, because that environmental impact obviously is so different depending on where you're at.
Right. And that's the thing about whenever we have to grow these populations. These populations we use were specifically from Dr. George Graff, our University of Nebraska breeder. These were lines developed by him and then grown in those local environments. And this genotype by environment interaction, we want to make sure that it's accounting for that local. If you get too broad, then you start to breed for genetics that might not be relevant to your particular area. So it's really about as you release cultivars, what broad area do you envision this cultivar to be released in? And then you need to test the specific genetics in that specific region to better estimate the stability of it.
Sure. So when it comes to some of the traits that you guys look for specifically in Nebraska, what are some of the key elements that you're hoping for? Is it, drought resistance? Is it, resistance to maybe soybean nematodes? What does it look like for you guys?
Yeah, it's really all comes down to I interact a lot with our Nebraska Soybean Board, and it's getting feedback from them on what are farmers really needing or what problems are they encountering in the field. And so like in Nebraska, which I know has been a problem down here in Kansas, soybean stem borer is starting to move up into Nebraska. And so we started a project collaborating with the Kansas soybean breeder here, Dr. Bill Shapaw, and looking at stem borer resistance. And so just like with the yield stability, we're trying to map resistant genes in soybean that are resistant to soybean stem borer. As we map those genes, we're hoping to start incorporating those into our breeding populations as we move forward. Another recent insect or pest has been soybean gall midge, is a new one that's been coming along and that we're starting to look at. But then, it's the other typical traits: iron deficiency, chlorosis, soybean cyst nematode, drought resistance. It's really what impacts the farmer. That's what we're most interested in.
Yeah, so ever-evolving research, it sounds like then. And I know that this has been a study that's been long-term for you, but when you look towards the future and, how fast the world of genetics is growing in terms of, scientific techniques that are able to be used, where do you see this research going?
Long-term, it's about how we can better analyze the data and ask better questions and understand the data, because we can collect a lot of data. You can collect a lot of data of how these plants grow in different environments. We can sequence the genomes and know all about their DNA and how they differ from each other. But then it's about putting that all together and figuring out these interactions. And so, you hear about in the long term, how can we apply artificial intelligence to better understand all these other interactions? Because you get multiple genes under different management practices, under different environments. It becomes a complex problem that, how do you best make sense of that data is really where the future is.
Well, David, I can't thank you enough for joining us today for this conversation about your research and for joining us here at K-State for this lectureship series. Hopefully it's been a great experience.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. It's great meeting new people, and I certainly enjoyed talking with you and the faculty here and the graduate students and learning about their projects. So it really helps with collaboration, and really like being here.
Absolutely. Well, happy to have you once again, everyone. That was University of Nebraska-Lincoln Associate Professor. He's the Haskins Professorship there at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. David Hyten joining us for a conversation on mapping selection for yield stability in soybeans. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's show with this week's wildlife segment, and joining us for that this week is K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So today you wanted to discuss kind of the management differences when it comes to rural coyotes versus urban coyotes.
For sure. This is something that, of course, over the last year, we've started to see more problems with urban coyotes, especially in the Kansas City area. So I'm starting to talk to folks about urban coyotes more than I have in the past.
It's a growing challenge, like you said, in the Kansas City area. And there's this scale almost of building aggression in these animals, right?
There is. So when we think about urban coyotes versus rural coyotes are typically going to be fearful of people. And in urban environments, coyotes are around people much more in close proximity, and people are much more likely to accept coyote presence more often than in rural places. And so coyotes get used to being around people. We call that habituation, and then that can lead to aggressive behavior from those coyotes.
That's what we don't want to happen here, is that habituation process, because once that happens, I understand it's kind of a point of no return.
It is. There's a lot of folks around the country that don't want coyotes to be hurt. And, the reality is that we're probably always going to have coyotes living in urban areas. And what we have to do is figure out a way to coexist with them, because they're here to stay. And one of the main methods that's being promoted for dealing with coyotes in urban areas is to haze them, which just means intentionally scare. And that works well when we first start seeing coyotes in these urban environments around people. It has been shown to be highly ineffective when we start trying to scare coyotes once they become habituated, and especially once they start acting aggressively towards people and pets.
Sure. So that hazing, what does that look like in an urban environment? Because there's only so many things you can do management-wise.
There are, and we typically think about this from a humane hazing standpoint. So we're not trying to hurt the animals, but we're going to yell at them, clap, make loud noises, potentially carry a big trash bag if we've got a coyote that's relatively close, flap that trash bag around. We can throw things in their general direction, but we're typically not trying to hit them. So if you throw a stick or a rock, throw it close to them, but the goal is not to hit them and injure them. But anything that you would do to try and chase a dog out of your yard that you didn't want to be there. Make noise, look big, and throw things in their general direction.
Sure. So an intimidation process almost there going on.
Yep.
And I understand that another contributing factor in these urban areas is kind of the feeding of coyotes, right?
It is, and some of that feeding is intentional and some of it's non-intentional. So when we look at urban coyote populations around the country, there's a lot of individual variation in their diet relative to how much human food they get or how natural of a diet they have. So a coyote's typically going to be making their living off of small mammals, rabbits, mice, and that sort of thing. And in urban areas, some of the coyotes are getting up to 60% of their diet from human-associated food. Some of that is going to be pet food. Some of it can be bird seed. Some of it can be things that they're digging out of the trash. And sometimes people intentionally feed coyotes because they like to see them. And the more of that human-associated food that these coyotes get, the more likely they are going to be to become habituated. So that's one way to try and help them not become habituated. We're actually seeing some coyotes in urban areas that are having health issues that relate back to that human-associated food. So they have different bacteria in their guts, and some of those differences have been linked to higher aggressiveness in domestic dogs. And so there could be some of these weird, unanticipated effects of coyotes eating human food in urban environments too.
Once again, we're trying to limit those negative interactions that we're having in urban environments, not encourage them.
That's exactly right. And one of the challenges with dealing with these animals is once they do become aggressive, that is when we need to start removing them, because once they basically get past being comfortable to be around people during the day, then those coyotes need to be removed because they've sort of passed the point of no return on that scale of aggressiveness and being habituated to people.
Well, Drew, I'm sure we'll continue our conversation on coyotes probably in the future. This isn't a problem, like you said, that's going away anytime soon. But thanks so much for these tips and these reminders.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad to do it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts joining us for a conversation on urban coyote management. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.